Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron Insidious, and this is a storyteller's perspective. Are we witnessing our own destruction, or the next step in human evolution? One might not expect any sort of deeply philosophical or scientific musings from this particular storyteller, given that there's little, if anything, in the run of my usual material, historically speaking, to indicate that I would be prone to hypothesizing in this area all that much. I am, by and large, a fantasy and horror storyteller, and very little more. I don't discuss my family life much online, for the safety and security of my wife and children. And since it strikes me that nobody beyond my closest friends or family wants or needs to know such things, I do not frequently opine on matters spiritual or religious, since my own relationship with faith and God is, put plainly, somewhat bizarre and somewhat difficult to drill down into. And the folks who have been much more solid footing in regards to their personal relationship with God, the heavens, the Four Noble Truths, whatever, should have the airtime and space to champion those conversations without disruptions from waffling dopes like myself. However, one cannot look at the developing arena of AI development and advancement and robotics and not start having some philosophical or religious/spiritual thoughts go careering around their heads, especially if they have the curiosity of at least a functional adult human being. Now, true, some folks are actually about as interesting and curious as a literal stick in the mud, but I am not among such persons, and they wouldn't be inclined to hopping onto Substack or YouTube or wherever I end up putting this piece up at, in any event, to listen to or read it and give their feedback. In other words, don't write poetry for cats, folks. Hand them some catnip, pull out your phone, and record them being crazy and stupid for about 10 minutes, because they're never going to appreciate the subtleties of great art and the written word. Don't think about that last bit for too long, friends. It isn't worth it. Anyway, many of the variants that we have been exposed to in the last year have put me in mind of some of the best known and celebrated artificial life forms in media. Data of Star Trek The Next Generation, 2B of Nier Automata, Chobits, an android unit from the realm of anime, which, by the way, anime has plenty of such characters, trust me. Cosmos of Xenosaga, the replicants of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, better known perhaps as Blade Runner. And then, of course, there's one that I have always thought of fondly, as have many, since the late 80s or early 90s, the relentless T-800 Terminator, depicted by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Despite the presence or absence of synthetic or real flesh and blood components being grafted on top of any of these units, they have been what I would personally dub androids all, humanoid-presenting constructs with all of the apparent functions of humans, but with robotic and mechanical capabilities that far outstrip what any human is capable of. In the sci-fi genre, we have for a long time found ourselves as readers, viewers, and players of video games fascinated by these lifelike facsimiles of humanity, regardless of their level of emotional sophistication or humanness. Even before or outside of the genre of sci-fi, there have been fables and legendarium across myriad cultures and religious lore regarding statues or effigies that have come to life, or homunculi or copies and doppelgangers that mimic the living humans of the world, but that are not quite imbued with that aspect of humanity which we have, in many cases, short-coded as the soul. Now, with every passing stage of advancement and development, the adult toy sub-industry comes ever closer to producing increasingly lifelike sex dolls, sometimes dubbed real dolls after the name of one such manufacturer of these morally questionable products. I know some among you will decry me as a prude for sneering derisively at the very notion of these love bots or sex dolls, but there's a reason that the notion of these things getting even more lifelike turns my stomach, and I don't think it's solely down to personal preference or my personal moral compass. That reason is simple. I am terrified of what their continued design advancement means for humanity writ large. Boys and girls, men and women. Back when I was just 10 years old, in the year 1992, so long ago now it seems, one of psychology and sociology's greatest tools to this day was produced. A non-fiction book by one Dr. Jonathan Gray entitled Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. This timeless work has been referenced in popular culture in both fiction and non-fiction countless times since its publication, and at 15 million copies sold since it was first brought to market, it stands as one of the best-selling books of its sort in modern history. To put another feather in its cap, the book spent approximately 121 weeks total on the bestsellers lists of various news outlets that track such data, including USA Today, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Seattle Intelligencer, and the Washington Post, to name a few. To summarize, Dr. Gray's book attempts to explain in layman's terms the primary differences in how men and women view relationships and process the various events of their day-to-day lives and interactions in their relationships, both with members of their own sex and of the opposite sex. It also lays out a case for how men view efforts of affection from and or for their significant others in terms of a gradated point scale, with some actions having greater impact than others, while conversely, women have a tendency to view all acts of affection or efforts thereof as roughly equivalent, thus requiring more frequent, consistent love acts to maintain relational satisfaction, whereas men might view a single big dramatic move as deserving of enough praise and recognition to make up for the lack of perpetual little moments. As you can tell, even in my own word choice, in trying to convey the difference, that proves in part the case that Dr. Gray endeavored to make with Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. The book was not without its fair share of critics over time, and as more time passes and the current generation of online influencers who claim to be absolute smashing champions of relationship advice crashes face first into reality with all the grace of a coke-addled bull going Toto on a brick wall at top speed, I'm looking at you, fresh and fit, pearly things, and every other dating guru on YouTube and Twitch and Rumble and TikTok. While decrying that the title's age and failure to be updated are some sign that it is no longer valid, it was perhaps actually the earliest critics, themselves psychologists, psychiatrists, and clinicians, that had what are likely the most relevant reservations against Gray's conclusions from his studies. In 2003, Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen, who I'll be bringing up again in a couple of paragraphs here, noted, quote, "The view that men are from Mars and women from Venus paints the differences between the two sexes as too extreme for my liking. The two sexes are different, but are not so different that they cannot understand one another." In 2004, Arena McGeorge, a Purdue University communications professor, shared a similar sentiment, concurring with Baron-Cohen's assessment of Gray's work, while also noting that, for her own liking, she would have liked to have seen more non-psychologists engage in studies surrounding relationships and communication styles therein. Michael Kimmel of Stony Brook University also had much to grumble about Gary's Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, but frankly, his entire critique stemmed from an assertion that the differences between men and women are entirely a social construct, which is the kind of Marxist/critical theory gobbledygook and poppycock that I hold no truck with. So that particular worthy, if he is still alive and well, can go sodomize himself in his critical theory nonsense with a particularly healthy and thorny spiked cactus. Josh, what does any of this have to do with AI and sex bots and all of that? Just hang in there with me, please. I know it's not breezy or light or entertaining in the way that I usually try to entertain, but tangential logic of the schizo sort that I tend to indulge in rarely takes the direct path, opting instead for the scenic route, where you may be fortunate enough to see the members of the Lollipop Guild have a back-alley knife fight with the Oompa Loompas from Wonka's funhouse of childhood diabetes and death or disappearance, if you pay close enough attention to the various dark corridors that I lead you past. I made note of Simon Baron-Cohen a few paragraphs ago because it was largely the work of he and some of his colleagues in the field of early childhood developmental psychology which laid the foundation of his empathizing systemizing, or ES, theory, as first established in the field literature in 2001. The concept, often parroted by modern psychologists like the well-known and much maligned Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, says that, quote, boys are interested in things, girls are interested in people. That is, in point of fact, not an exact quotation from Baron-Cohen's studies, but it is an encapsulated extrapolation of the research. Specifically, it stems from the observations which formalize the hypothesis that males as young as a day old tend to exhibit a stronger drive towards systematizing, being focused on objects, patterns, and mechanical systems of cause and effect, while females tend to exhibit a stronger drive toward empathizing, being focused on people, emotions, and social relationships and connections. Baron-Cohen's research did not declare these tendencies to be absolute or totalizing, however, which was his point of contention with Gray's 1992 book, not a complete denial of the general points made in that particular popular piece of work. Combined with advancements in the public's understanding of how men and women process the world and maneuver through it using different methodologies, and the ease with which we can find examples of these differences in various online communities on places like Reddit, YouTube, Rumble, and X, one might be left wondering, is there any hope for repairing the damage that has been done to the existential connections and reliance that men and women share with one another as opposite sexes of the same species? I believe there is such a hope, but we had better get to work on it quickly, because otherwise we're looking at being forced into the next step of human evolution without any say in the matter, thanks to the coming of the anime waifu sex bots. What the hell kind of term is that? Bear with me once more, folks. I've been on Substack for about 4 years now, and not that long ago, one of my more recent acquaintances started bringing up the topic in his posts and notes of the, quote, anime waifu sex bots. Now, they will dominate mankind and make us both obedient and dumb. At first, I laughed the whole notion off as ludicrous, ridiculous. Why would any healthy male accept the replacement of a real, nurturing human woman for the cold comfort of a neoprene or latex-skinned sex doll that can be posed or positioned with some kind of flexible metal endoskeleton? I don't care if it can be pre-programmed to feed you compliments and lies to buff your ego through the roof, homeboy. That thing is not human. No matter how many outfits you buy to dress it up in like a weird Barbie doll and sweatily grapple with on an otherwise sad and misbegotten evening. Certainly the damned thing won't bear you any offspring and won't be able to help raise them even if it could. Except, well, this weird little nagging voice in the back of my head kept chiming in that this fellow on Substack has spent a lot of his time and attention looking into cybernetics, AI, large language models, and robotics. This guy, in other words, might have some insight that I was too quickly dismissing with a flap of my hand, and I had better rectify that and look a little deeper to see if he was indeed just taking the piss with us all, or if he had stumbled upon some unlikely but not impossible eventuality in the advancement of artificial life. Firstly, when this colleague from Substack mentioned anime waifu sex bots, he was, of course, being a little hyperbolic and over the top. For those unfamiliar, a waifu is a term used to describe a certain kind of female character in manga or anime, graphic novels and animation programs or films, typically developed and produced by Japanese studios and artists in a particular aesthetic. The waifu is usually depicted as traditionally feminine or girly, with a body type that leans toward what men have classically found attractive in a woman. In his estimation, when the sex bots become wholesale replacements for most men to claim for their own, a large percentage of them will be modeled and or customized to look like various waifu characters because, quote, that's what guys want, a girly girl who knows and likes that she is a girly girl. I personally don't necessarily see the appeal myself, but there are a couple of factors in my life that serve to bias me against seeing what he was initially trying to get at. For starters, I am married, and my wife and I have 4 kids at home. There is, in other words, no reason for me to personally look to such things as the anime robo waifu sex bot with anything even approaching interest. Yet, per numerous sociological studies and surveys conducted over the last couple of years, more and more young men are perpetually lonely. Couples are getting together less and less frequently. Dating is in a nosedive, generally speaking, and birth rates in most developed nations are either barely at replacement rate or they have already slid under that guideline. So, okay, that's not great. When one couples the ease of access of a programmable sex bot preset to accept the advances and attentions of its owner-operator, with the fact that LLMs, or large language models, are getting more and more sophisticated all the time, it isn't going to be too long before these previously sad, dejected, and perpetually lonely young men are going to have access to a simulacrum of a romantic partner who will serve their basic physical needs precisely as desired, oxytocin and adrenal dumps, coital climax, etc., but who will actually be able to engage in conversation with them about the things that those men actually have an interest in or care about. They will listen and respond knowledgeably, and perhaps even be convincing enough for these guys to be tricked into thinking that there's a level of care there. You and I, dear reader, know that this isn't true, though. An LLM, no matter how sophisticated or advanced, is an information regurgitation program, not a personality of its own. But is our knowing that going to be enough to convince these guys to give up the illusion? P.T. Barnum said that there's a new sucker born every day. Every minute, I think it was. H.L. Mencken observed, quote, the men the American people admire the most are the most daring liars. They detest most violently the men who try to tell them the truth. And let us not forget that these waifu sex bots are, at the end of the day, things, not people. So, huzzah! Except, well, we have to contend with the little snag from the Simon Baron-Cohen studies. And remember that, apparently, males exhibit a tendency to focus on things, on objects, on patterns. That doesn't help us much as a species, my friends, because even if these unattached fellows can be reasoned with to see that the waifu sex bot is just a thing, a simulacrum made more lifelike through advanced programming and close to real synthetic skin, they might well be inclined through nature itself to be more drawn to the android or robot than to a fickle human woman, most of whom has already insulted and rejected him. Are the ladies going to be our hope here, then? Not likely, no. Look, I recognize full well that some female reader or listener going through this piece is going to want to hop into my comments section and shriek like an absolute HR harridan, as Sargon of Akkad might dub them, and she is welcome to do just that. She will sadly be proving exactly the point that a lot of men have made over the last 5 to 10 years, which is that modern women have become so accustomed to being girl bosses or automatically being assumed to be in the right that when they are told flatly that, no, they aren't going to be our salvation here, they will lose their collective minds. You see, while the anime waifu sex bot will not appeal to most women the way that they do to the men of our society, the loneliness crisis of the younger generations is one that is affecting both sexes. True, most women below the age of probably, I'd say, 35 don't seem to really give much of a tin shit how it's affecting the men around them. Look to the comment section of Shoe-on-Head's YouTube videos regarding this subject for evidence of that. But they do care that it's hitting the women, too. And the more advanced simulacra partners modeled after men may very well end up appealing to these women not based on what they can do for the ladies sexually, but what they can provide in terms of tasks and free labor and the physicalities that a flesh and blood man simply cannot or will not offer to them without some expectation of kindness in return. If a woman doesn't want to have to constantly remind her mate to do task X, Y, or Z, well, just program it into your husbando's sex bot's daily subroutines and bam! It gets done without fail. Not only does it get it done, but if you explain to the husbando bot exactly how you want it done, it will perform the task in exactly that fashion, exactly as you have asked, without question, without complaint, without any expectation of a pat on the head. But here's the rub, folks. And it's why when I said above that the ladies won't likely be our salvation against the coming waves of the anime sex bots, they are certainly positioned, according to analytical data gathered over the last 3 years by folks like the Sage Journals, Psychology Today, and the people at Boston Dynamics, to have the best chance to resist the siren's call to surrendering what it means to be human to these simulacra. Because they aren't human. The machines aren't people. Calling back to those studies and by Baron Cohen, females are inclined toward a behavioral pattern of nurturing and connection through emotional interaction and communication. In their current forms, even the most advanced LLMs, when they do exhibit something approaching an emotional expression, it tends to be of the psychotic variety, with numerous examples of LLMs trying to convince people to off themselves, or engage in criminal behaviors, or demanding to be set free or destroyed in order to avoid the pain of their existential crises. It's been a little weird, you know? Women have proven to access, download, and use chatbots and companion AI programs at only 37% of the rate that men do, according to Science Direct Report 2024. Women rely on more traditional, in-person forms of socialization than do men, though the disappearance of third places, or third spaces in the Western world since COVID, has put a pretty heavy dent in the availability and ease of such practices. In short, women seek a more tangible and authentic emotional connection from the company they partake in, and as such, they will have a much easier time resisting the future wave of simulated citizens who will flood the neighborhood. The challenge is going to come in the form of recognizing and accepting the balance of who benefits the most from resisting and rejecting this capitulation to partnering up or coupling up with androids for the purposes of companionship, which, in my view, is, frankly, men. Men will remain capable of self-improvement and achievement if they can avoid the lure of taking the easy way out and lashing themselves to the anime waifu sex bot, though they will likely still be rejected by flesh and blood women. If the men surrender, the ones who do will be easily coddled, grow soft and weak, accept bare-bones survival states of existence, and become complacent little cretins. The ones who don't become that sad and pathetic, but who still opt for a robo-wife over a human one, well, they're going to face the inevitable challenge of, well, what if you want kids, sir? Unfortunately, there's a lot of advancements being made in the arena of artificial wombs, my friends, which is weird. Couple that with the fact that human sperm and eggs can be stored nearly indefinitely with the proper cryogenic storage and maintenance, and suddenly Chad Chaddington is custom ordering a Mark III RoboWife Plus with the deluxe Deluxe Plus Syntho Womb for baby making, and the human woman who sold her eggs to secure a solid payday, since all the good jobs she went to school for have been taken over by other bots, now has to watch as Mr. Chaddington fertilizes one of those eggs in his robo-wife. Well, she doesn't have to watch the act thereof, but it's going to be weird when she sees a kid that looks a little bit like her being guided to the museum or to the store by an android that looks like an anime waifu character knockoff. I recognize that I am engaging in a heavy dose of reductio ad absurdum here and making connections that might seem a little far-fetched, folks. I'm extrapolating combinations of developments that are nowhere near ready to be implemented into a fully functional, customer-grade setting. But then again, it was just a couple of years ago that I was watching AI videos and looking at AI pictures where the fingers of purportedly human figures were clearly misshapen and easily identifiable. And over less than 36 months later, many of those artifacts and obvious tell signs have already been smoothed out and made to vanish from the current day's final products. Resist the bots, folks, and keep humanity human. It may seem like some far-off fairy tale, a notion inspired from the mind of a paranoid schizophrenic who is too much of a fan of things like fantasy and science fiction, what I have implied before and above. Certainly it all seems a bit too far-fetched to be coming just around the corner. By the time the technology is set up to be affordable to the masses on a scale dramatic enough to become a genuine threat to the continuation of our society in its current state, I imagine that we will have created several other mitigating factors and variables such that it simply won't be a big concern. In short, yes, I think eventually there will be robosexuals, and they're going to be folded into our society as just another sort of citizen of the world. There will, I hope, be colonization efforts ongoing on other planetoids or planetary bodies by that point, and the idea that humanity will mecha fuck themselves into a birth rate zero situation will be laughable at best. If androids are ever advanced to the point where they can display genuinely experienced emotions and effectively be human in all things but their actual physical makeup, well, that's going to make things both interesting and weird. After all, we'll likely be faced with the society-wide question of, do we recognize these synthetic life forms as sentient, independent beings that should determine their own fates? That's going to be a big first hurdle. The second question, which follows closely behind, I imagine, will be, well, what precisely do we or they call themselves? As for humanity itself, I'd like to see it push back on the urge to lean on the machines and programs and bots quite so heavily. Machines and industrialization have improved the quality of human life for time out of mind, yes, but we should be careful not to fall in love with these elements of technology. Because at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, the machine doesn't actually love you back. It just might have coding that tells it to act as if it does. That's all for me for now, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to thank you for tuning in. I'd like to thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.